Okay, good afternoon, everybody, to all of you here in the classroom and the many who are following through the Zoom channel. And welcome to today's seminar, the Southeast Asia Research Center seminar. My name is Diego Fossati. I am assistant professor here at the Department of Public and International Affairs and associate director of CERC. This is one of our last seminars this semester. We're getting towards the end of a very productive semester for us. This is the seventh seminar that we host, and it is a pleasure to welcome today Professor Nick Kuipers from the National University of Singapore. I'll just say something to introduce the speaker. Professor Kuipers is an assistant professor of political science at NUS and a presidential young professor at the National University of Singapore. His research is interested in understanding how institutions structure political attitudes and has been published or is forthcoming in journals such as the American Political Science Review, the British Journal of Political Science, Perspective of Politics, and World Politics. Our guest has a truly outstanding scholarship and publication record. Nicola has received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and was previously a pre-doctoral scholar at the Center of Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. As usual, I have asked our speaker to prepare for a presentation of about 40 minutes, after which we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. The title of Professor Kuipers today is Preference Mismatch for Environmental Politics in Environmental Policy in Indonesia. Without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to our guest. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Diego. And thanks, Mark, for joining online, even though you're feeling a little under the weather. If you can't hear me at any point, Mark, just speak up and I'll pick up the mic, okay? So again, thanks for the invitation, and thanks for being here. It's my first time in Hong Kong. I'm very excited. So like Diego said, today I'm going to be presenting very early stage research that's joint with Alan Xiao at Princeton, entitled Preference Mismatch for Environmental Policy in Indonesia. So what I'll do is I'll talk for about 45 minutes about the project. I hope that's okay. And, it's a sort of small group, so, feel free to interrupt me and sort of, we can have a discussion as things go if it feels appropriate. But like I said, this is early stage research, so we're sort of really looking forward to any feedback or comments that you might have. So the project is motivated by three observations. The first is that Indonesia today faces a series of what we call interlocking environmental challenges. So the first, and I think the most prominent or most famous, is the issue of deforestation, and particularly the use of fires for the clearing of primary and secondary forest in Indonesia. So in the course of writing this paper, we dug up some statistics about this phenomenon, and I was quite shocked to learn about the scale of it. So since 2001, Indonesia has lost about 31 million hectares of primary and secondary forest tree cover to deforestation. So this is the size of Germany, right? So this is a huge amount of deforestation. A lot of this is what they call commodity-driven deforestation, with both large corporations and small farmers clearing land to make way for, say, palm oil plantations. And as you also know, a lot of this forest conversion makes use of burning, which is cheaper than, say, mechanical means that use tractors. And so it's, I think, more desirable to boost profit motives, to boost the sort of bottom line. But under drought conditions, these sorts of burning techniques can spark wildfires that release CO2 and cause respiratory illness. And so this becomes really bad during El Nino years, as last year was, in which Indonesia lost about 1 million hectares of forest cover to fires. But like I said, there's sort of interlocking environmental challenges. So the second that we want to draw your attention to is this issue of flooding and sea level rise. So this becomes especially pronounced as climate change is going to increase sea levels over the next few decades. And it's going to become especially catastrophic in urban coastal areas in Southeast Asia, in which you face land subsidence, right? Jakarta is sinking, which means that In Jakarta's case, it faces about $300 million in damages from flooding every year, right? So this is another, and I think one of the more recent environmental challenges that's come on the scene in the past decade or so is the issue of mining and natural resource extraction. So the most famous would be the issue of nickel. Indonesia supplies about 50% of the world's nickel, which is a key input to electric vehicle batteries. It sits on approximately 20% of global reserves of nickel. And so as the EV industry picks up pace, Indonesia is going to continue to extract this precious metal. Now, the negative externality of the extraction process is that the smelting of nickel combines the metal with various toxic chemicals in order to purify it, that then get dejected into waterways at the end of the smelting process, right? And so a consequence of this is an environmental degradation. Right? So this is the first observation, which is that Indonesia faces very serious environmental challenges. The second observation is that despite these problems, very few politicians in Indonesia seem to really care about producing environmental policy. So at least at the national level, politicians care more about economic development and what Eve Warburton calls resource nationalism. And so you can see this in the recent export ban on raw nickel, right? This is Jokowi's initiative to boost economic development by promoting the development of a domestic nickel refinement industry, right? But this, of course, incentivizes further extraction on the part of domestic players. There was a blanket ban on new forest conversions in primary forests, but this hasn't really been matched with genuine enforcement, right? It gets passed down to the district level, and district officials don't do a tremendous job of enforcing this blanket ban. But in Indonesia, with decentralization in the early 2000s, local governments were nominally handed the authority to manage the environment, right? So even though you see these things happening at the national level, most of the action ought to be at the local level. So for instance, revenues derived from logging permits and mining concessions, these things constitute own source revenues, which are scrutinized less than central government transfers. And therefore, this provides politicians at the local level with an incentive to court this sort of extraction, right? Because they prefer own source revenues over central government transfers. And so here again, you see very little action at the local level. The frontline enforcement of environmental protections, like the blanket ban, for instance, this frontline enforcement is given to district level officials, but district level officials are captured by clientelism at a much higher rate than national level government officials, right? And so again, all of this is to say that our second observation is that there's very little policy action on this issue despite growing severity. And then the third observation, and this comes from data that we collected for this project, the third observation is that despite these problems being real and serious and politicians doing very little, voters actually really care about environmental policy. So what I'm showing you here on the x-axis is the percentage of respondents in Indonesia who said the issue of pollution was very important. Okay? And this red dotted line is the average across all different provinces in Indonesia. And you see about 58% of respondents saying pollution is very important to them. They want to see government action on this issue. Now it's broken down by province on the y-axis. So you see a lot of variation across provinces that we could, I'm sure, discuss for quite a long time. But just to draw your attention, you see at the top Sulawesi Barat, which is a province that's faced a lot of rare earth metal extraction over the past decade or so, right? So here you're seeing a lot of the pollution around, say, the extraction of nickel. And we think these three observations are puzzling, right? So voters care about environmental issues. And so, standard theories of political representation from political science, from economics, would predict that politicians would move their policy to align with the preference of voters. It's a sort of a Downsian median voter theory, right? If they didn't, they would face electoral sanctioning. So this motivates for us the question that we try and answer, which is why do Indonesian politicians underproduce policy to protect the environment? What we do in the paper, and what I'll show you in this presentation, is that we develop a, I think, very simple model of policy in action that draws attention to two key frictions for the production of policy. So the first is what we call the costs to policy action. So these are costs incurred by politicians who may face a range of costs for deviation from the status quo, which is in this case, environmental exploitation. And so there's many ways to think about this. One way is that politicians who deviate from the status quo environmental exploitation may face costs from, say, corporations or plantation owners who can withhold campaign financing from those politicians who deviate. And that's a very simple way. Voters also face costs, but they face costs to communication. It's costly for voters to take time out of their day to communicate their preferences on environmental policy to politicians. And of course, there's an opportunity cost to communicating this preference of environmental policy action, in that it's difficult to then say you care about a different issue, right? And this in turn leads to politicians misperceiving voter preferences. If voters are not communicating because they face this cost, politicians are going to underestimate the extent to which voters demand action on that issue. So I'll explain a little bit later on in greater detail how we're thinking about these two costs. But we think that this provides with sort of enough of a framework to evaluate these sorts of hypotheses about the cost to action and the cost of communication. And in order to evaluate these hypotheses, whether or not they're preventing policy action from occurring, we join two sources of data. The first is a voter survey that we conducted in December 2023, and this is about 5,200 Indonesian voters, and we asked them for their preferences for environmental policy. Okay. The second source of data is a candidate survey. It's a panel survey of legislative candidates at the local level in Indonesia. It's a three-wave survey. So we conducted this survey in November, January, and then April. The final wave is ongoing right now. And it's a panel in the sense that we surveyed the same politicians each of the three times. And in the survey, we gauged politicians' preferences, their own preferences for environmental policy. We engaged their perceptions of how they thought voters cared about environmental policy. And then in the second wave of the survey, we did something unique, which is that we conducted an experiment in which we provided half of the politicians with information about what their voters wanted, right? To see how it then changed their preferences and their perceptions for environmental policy. And so to sort of save you the suspense, I'll just give you the three main findings that I'm going to show you in the next 30 minutes of the talk. So the first finding is that we do this descriptive exercise where we compare the preferences of voters to the preferences of politicians when it comes to environmental policy. And I'm going to show you that voters demand environmental action. They care more about the environment than politicians do. Second, politicians underestimate how much voters want environmental policy. So we asked politicians, how much do you think voters care about this issue? And they radically underestimate how much voters want it. The second finding relates to this experiment that I just mentioned to you. And so I said that there's this big gap between what politicians think voters want and what voters actually want. And so the experiment tries to correct this gap, right? We try and shorten the distance between those two things to see if it then leads politicians to demand policy or produce policy. And so what we show is that providing politicians with correct information about their voters' preferences leads to learning, right? Politicians learn what their voters want. We can show this. And it leads to some uptake of politicians preferring environmental policy. But it doesn't lead politicians to actually support concrete policy proposals. Right? So in other words, they're learning about their voters' preferences. They themselves are observing some preference change, but it doesn't actually lead them to support environmental policy, right? So talk is very cheap. And we think this is sort of puzzling, right? There's some evidence of learning taking place, but it doesn't lead to actual support for new policy. Why is this the case, right? And so what we do with the third finding is we try and explain this policy in action. And what we do is we take aim at these costs policy action that I was describing earlier, focusing on the extra legal costs that clientelistic interests or oligarchic interests can impose on politicians who deviate from the status quo. And the way we do this is we construct an index of clientelism at a local level in Indonesia. And this draws on data from local public officials' assets that they have to submit to the Anti-Corruption Commission. And we assume that if politicians in a given district have high levels of assets, that means there's high levels of clientelism. And I think this is a fair assumption in Indonesia, right? The wages and salaries of public officials are low. The only way to get rich is typically through clientelistic exchange. And what we show using this index is that this experiment worked to increase policy action, but only in places where the extent of elite capture is low. So in other words, in these districts where politicians are not faced with serious extra legal costs for deviation from the status quo, then providing them with information about what voters wanted actually led them to support policy consistent with voter preferences. So these are sort of the three findings that I'll make my way through over the next, I guess, 30 minutes or so. And feel free to stop me as I go if you have any questions. Okay. So this paper is co-authored with an economist, so we have a formal model in the paper. So I'll do a very sort of brief job of explaining what this formal model is doing. So we developed this simple model of policy and action, like I said. So imagine you have two sets of actors, right? Voters and politicians. And voters want to express a policy preference, call it V. Right? But expressing this preference is costly. So this is a cost parameter C. And you can think narrowly or flexibly about this cost parameter. It takes time to express preferences. That incurs opportunity costs on things you might be doing otherwise. And what this means is that all else equal, voters are going to underexpress their true policy preference B. Even if that cost is very narrow or very, very small, they're still going to underexpress by some margin. Politicians, for their part, generally want to produce some policy outcome, call it P, right? And they want to do that as a function of V, voter policy preferences. Because if they didn't do so, then they would face electoral sanction. But policy action itself is also costly, right? So again, we can think about this flexibly or narrowly. Politicians are surely also sensitive to their time constraints, right? So all else equal, let's just say that they're sort of not going to want to produce policy. It takes time to produce legislation. But also there are these extra legal costs that might come from, say, clientelistic interests who prevent them or withhold bribes or campaign finance in the event that they deviate from the status quo. So what this means is that all else equal, politicians are going to underdeliver. Now, the result that we show in the formal model is that policy inaction is the equilibrium result. Okay? Voters are going to underexpress their preferences. Politicians will thus, partly as a function of that, partly as a function of the costs of policy action, politicians will underdeliver. And then this leads to a descending spiral. Voters further underexpress their preferences because they anticipate inaction, and politicians further underdeliver, right? So it's a very bleak portrait. Now, we don't think that this is like a genuine representation of what happens in the policy cycle, but instead it sort of structures the analysis that I'll present later on. And so what we do to sort of put it in words is we take several hypotheses or predictions from this formal model and we take it to the data. So the first is that our framework anticipates a discrepancy between voters' first order preferences and politicians' second order beliefs, right? So remember that it's costly for voters to express their preferences, and so politicians are going to have a hard time understanding what voter preferences are. And so, the vocabulary I'm using here, first order preferences capture one's own preferences, what you yourself desire or want. Second order beliefs are someone's beliefs about someone else's preferences, right? So a politician, it's a politician's belief about voters' preferences. So this is what we call a second order belief. Again, we expect a disjuncture between these two things. This is the first expectation. The second expectation that we had going in was that providing politicians with correct data on voters' first order beliefs should encourage action. It should lead them to support policy action consistent with those voter preferences. But this should only happen when second order beliefs are wrong in the first place. If politicians already know what voters precisely want, there's no scope for this new information to support new policy action, right? If I know exactly what voters want and you come and give me information saying this is what voters want, you're going to say, well, I'm already doing what voters want. So there's no scope for this information to change anything. The third expectation we have is that when politicians' perceived costs to action are really, really high, right? Say you're in a district in which you're making tremendous amounts of money off of bribes being paid to you. And if you deviate from the status quo, those bribes are going to be taken away from you. inaction will persist even after we express voter preferences. Right? So this is a sort of extreme statement of elite capture. And so these are sort of the three hypotheses that we then take to the data. So like I said, this framework is a very, I think, generic framework. It's not specific to environmental policy. I think it works for other areas as well. But we take it to this context of environmental policy in Indonesia. So I'll just go through where things currently stand when it comes to environmental policy in this context. And I'll start at the central government level. So the good news is that the central government's taken, I think, several nominally proactive steps to manage the impacts of climate change in Indonesia. So the Ministry of Environment and Forestry released a large report on climate resilience, and this included a bold prediction for the achievement of peak emissions in Indonesia by the year 2030. They also committed to carbon neutral by 2050. Right? Now, this is sort of in name only. Whether or not they actually genuinely achieve this, I think, is a matter of serious debate. As I mentioned earlier, they introduced a blanket ban on primary forest conversion for commodity use. This is, again, I think, a good thing. The 2021 law on tax harmonization included a framework for the introduction of carbon tax, which is also, I think, for climate activists, seen as a major win. So in practice, in theory, these are all, I think, positive things for the achievement of for managing the effects of climate change. Now, the bad news is that, at least over the last 10 years, the Jokowi administration, their record thus far has largely prioritized exploitation over, I think, conservation or climate adaptation. So the new IKN plan, that plan to move the capital from Jakarta to Kalimantan, I think this reflects very little concern for climate adaptation or mitigation. Right? Jakarta is sinking; they'll become increasingly prone to flooding as sea levels rise. And rather than staying and sort of managing this crisis, they're going to say, well, we're picking up stakes, we're going to move to Kalimantan, right? So I think there's little concern for genuine adaptation. In 2020, the central government centralized the right to grant mining concession permits. This used to be at the local level. And initially, environmental activists said this is very good. At the local level, there's a lot of corruption happening, and this was leading to a lot of mining permits being issued. But now that it's at the central government level, it'll be much better. There'll be fewer permits issued. But this is not what actually happened. Of course, this was all part of Jokowi's plan for downstreaming the mining industry and promoting further extraction. And then finally, this carbon tax that I mentioned earlier, was initially slated to be introduced in 2022, but this has been pushed back until 2025, and I think will likely continue to be pushed back beyond that date as well. So the good news is, in theory, there's all these commitments being made, but the bad news is that in practice, a lot of it's not really happening. So again, this is sort of this portrait of policy in action. Now, like I said, most of the action is actually at the local level, right? So with the passage of these decentralization laws in 1999 and 2004, the management of the environment was devolved down to these district level governments, Kabupaten Kota in Indonesia. The challenge, not just with environmental issues, but with really all policy issues, but especially those that have distributive consequences, is that local governments in Indonesia are plagued with corruption and elite capture that obtains through clientelistic exchange. So here, this is sort of a trivial graph, but I think it speaks to this point. So in this red line, I'm showing you the number of corruption convictions that have occurred at each level of government in Indonesia. And this blue line is at the district level or the Kabupaten level in Indonesia. You just see it sort of spiking up past 600 convictions since 2016, right? So this is really a big problem. Now, clientelism is important for our story and how we're thinking about environmental policy in action. And so it's worth, I think, just mentioning very briefly how it operates in the Indonesian context. So we think about it operating through three different actors. And so the first is voters, candidates for elected office in Indonesia, policymakers, have to shower voters in cash in advance of elections, right? This phenomenon called money politics. And this drives up the cost of campaign finance. Whether or not this works to sway voters, I think, is a matter of serious concern and debate. But the fact remains, all politicians do this, right? They spend thousands of US dollars, even at local level elections, to try and win voters this way. Political parties in Indonesia will often expect, but not always, but often expect candidates on legislative tickets to pay for positions on the ballot or legislative lists. All of this drives up the cost of running for office in Indonesia, right? The election sort of campaign finance in Indonesia is tremendously expensive. And so what happens is that politicians try to finance these outlays through different mechanisms, right? If they've used personal finance to fund their campaigns, this creates incentives for graft once they win office, right? They need to recoup this money. But if they turn to outside donors during the campaign, this creates incentives for influence peddling, right? So oftentimes candidates in, say, rural regions will turn to large firms or businessmen, say people who own plantations, whose profits depend on environmental extraction and exploitation. And if they've accepted money from these sorts of firms, there's an expectation that they won't deviate from the status quo of environmental exploitation once they get to office, right? These are sort of the costs to action that we're thinking. And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, and the sort of comparative neglect of the environmental issue in Indonesia, what I'm showing you here on the y-axis is the percentage of candidates for different offices over different election cycles that mention in their official campaign platform these different issues, whether it's economic development in gray, healthcare in blue, or the environment in green, right? And here you see 2019, 2024, and then for these three different levels of government. So in this study, we're focusing on the most local level of legislative government, the DPRD2. And what you see is that in 2019, only 1% of candidates mentioned environmental issues in their platform. Now, this increased in the most recent election, which we focus on, to 3%, but it's still dwarfed by these other issues, development and healthcare, right? So again, this, I think, builds up this idea that there's sort of comparative neglect of the issue of environmental policy in Indonesia. Okay, so how can we study this more systematically? What can we do about it in order to spur perhaps action? So what we do, like I say, is join two sources of data, and I'm just going to spend more time than I usually would talking about these data sources, in part because Diego, you might find the data interesting, and it's all publicly available now. And so, I think we're hoping that people will use this data not just for this project, but for others as well. So the first source of data comes from this voter survey, and this is data that I've collected jointly with Nathaniel Sumaktoyo, my colleague at NUS. And it's this initiative called SIKAP, in which we're conducting weekly surveys of 1,600 voters in Indonesia. We've been doing it since November 2023. And we're going to keep going until January 2025. We'll have interviewed about 100,000 voters by the end of it. And I should also say, in addition to the data being made public, each week about 20% of the survey space is free. And we've, I think, tried to make this space available to researchers who might have an interest in including a question, but don't perhaps have the research funding at the moment to field their own survey. And so, again, if you have questions you want to include, anyone can email us and we can try and get them on. These are online surveys conducted by Cint, the company formerly known as Lucid. And we use a quota sampling procedure that ensures representation on region, age, and gender. What we do on this survey is measure first order preferences, asking voters how important or unimportant they think different issues are. And we focus mainly on the issue of climate change and pollution. And then we also measure their second order beliefs, asking them what they think politicians think to be important. One of the big concerns with these sorts of online surveys is that there's concern that they do a bad job capturing population level estimates, right? That they're not genuinely representative. And so what we do to try and get a sense of this bias is that we benchmark our online survey estimates against what we presume to be the ground truth of electoral returns. Okay, so we asked survey respondents in advance of the 2024 election who they intended to vote for. And in the week before the election, we found that we estimated that Prabowo would obtain 56.6% of the Indonesian election or electoral vote. This is statistically indistinguishable from the observed outcome of 58%, and in fact did a better job in capturing the true result than a lot of surveys based on stratified random sampling and face-to-face surveying techniques, like as seen with Indicator and LSI, for instance, right? So here, what we're doing is looking at the vote share for these different candidates, Anies, Prabowo, Ganjar, and then broken down by age. And then we compare these different tranches to Indicator's exit poll, which was conducted by through random sampling, 3,000 voters conducted on election day. And what you see is that these results are actually, statistically indistinguishable. In other words, the survey that we conducted did a very good job of capturing reality. And this is a tangential point, but I think what's going on here is that online surveys tend to oversample highly educated people in most contexts, right? In the developing world, but also in more developed country contexts. And education is typically a polarizing variable. Okay? In Indonesia, it's not. There's comparatively very little educational polarization, which means that online surveys, I think, are getting quite good in this context at capturing population level parameters. Okay. So in other words, I think, we feel good about this data. This is gonna, I think, just give you a quick sense, and then I'm gonna sort of speed up. I think I'm taking a little bit longer than expected. So what we're showing you here is the sort of first order beliefs of different voters over time. And the issues in green are environment and climate change. And you can see that they're not the most important issues, but they're quite important. They're quite salient over time, right? All right, the second survey that we conducted is this local legislative candidate survey. And this is about 3 panel surveys of 800 candidates. Like I said, these are candidates running for DPRD2 elections. And the sampling procedure here involves genuine random sampling of 80 kabupaten kota, and then we randomly sampled 10 candidates within those kabupaten kota. We think it's a good survey. Contact rate was 80%. We have a high recontact rate as well. And in this survey, what we did was we measured politicians' first order and their second order beliefs using the same measures from the voter survey. But what's really neat about this is the informational experiment that we're able to conduct. So what we're going to show you is that there's an error in politicians' second order beliefs. They incorrectly estimate how much voters want environmental policy. And what we can do with this experiment is reduce that error to see if it then leads to sustained policy action. And so at the beginning of wave 2, enumerators were trained to provide candidates with a briefing, right? We gave them basically a slide deck that contained information on voter preferences, which was based on the answers collected in the voter survey that I was describing earlier. This report also contained aggregate data on politicians' preferences, and so they saw a figure that compared voters' first order beliefs with politicians' second order beliefs. And we could say, look, this is how much you guys were off by. And then what we do in order to measure the effects of this briefing that enumerators gave to half of the politicians is that we introduce new measures. We introduce measures capturing politicians' perceived sense of urgency about different environmental issues. And then we also measured their support for very concrete policy proposals. So first is a carbon tax, and then the second policy proposal was a total ban on new deforestation, including on secondary forests. Okay. All right, so I'm going to walk you through our 3 findings, our 3 sets of results. So the first set of results relates to these descriptive findings that I was mentioning earlier. Okay. So what I'm showing you here on the x-axis is the percent of respondents who say an issue is very important. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the different issues: health, education, economy, minority rights, and then the climate change issues and pollution are down here. Now, the black dots represent voters' first order beliefs. right? These are issues that voters say are very important to them, and the extent to, or excuse me, how many voters say this issue is very important to them. The gray dots are what politicians say are very important to them. So there are three things to highlight here. The first, if you look only at the black dots, voters care about environmental issues. So they care about climate change. About 50% say it's very important. About 57% say pollution is very important. This is less than the number that care about health and education, but it's not massively so, right? I mean, these are broadly comparable in terms of how much voters care about these issues. The second thing to notice is that politicians care more about these traditional welfare issues, health and education. Politicians care more about these issues than voters do. Meanwhile, politicians care much less about these issues like pollution and climate change than voters do. So here, only about 30% of politicians say climate change is very important. But here, about 50% of voters do, right? So that's a 20 percentage point gap in terms of their own first order preferences, what they personally care about. The second finding, what we're doing here is keeping those black dots the same. These are still the percentage of voters who say an issue is very important to them. But now the gray dot is the percentage of politicians who say that voters think that issue is very important. So there's two things to highlight here. The first thing is that with these traditional political issues, health, education, the economy, politicians are like very, very good at estimating how much voters care about this. Right? These are statistically indistinguishable. Like stunningly good at understanding how much voters want these different issues. But when it comes to the issues like pollution and climate change, and also minority rights, politicians massively underestimate how much voters care about this. So again, recall 50% of voters say climate change is very important to them. About 28% of politicians say that voters think that this issue is very important. So in other words, they're doing a very bad job of estimating how much voters care about environmental issues. And we have like a lot of sort of pet theories about why they're so good at these issues and so bad at these issues, but we don't have a sort of compelling way of interrogating it, right? So for our purposes, the important thing is that they are bad at estimating these things, and we're going to try and correct them and see what happens when we correct them. But it's interesting that they're so good at those issues, Okay, so here's, these are the two findings, the descriptive findings. Voters care more about environmental issues than politicians do. And politicians massively underestimate how much voters care about these issues. And so in the next part of the presentation, what I'm going to try and do is see what the effect is of correcting politicians' second order beliefs. Okay. And so here on the x-axis is the estimated treatment effect. Right? So this is the effect of giving politicians that informational report that tells them that voters care about these issues to this degree. And then what we're looking at first is the effect of this information on politicians' perceptions of citizens' concerns. So in other words, we're telling them that you estimated only 30% of voters cared about climate change. We're showing you that 50% do. How much more likely are you now to say that voters think climate change is very important? And what you see is that there's a 10.5 percentage point uptick, right? In other words, politicians are learning that voters care more about climate change as a function of this report that we gave them. There's a 9.1 percentage point increase in the proportion of politicians who say voters believe pollution to be very important. And then a 3.2 percentage point increase in the proportion of politicians who say voters believe minority rights to be very important. There's no effect on these other issues. But if you recall, these are the three issues on which there's a huge gap, right? These issues, there's no gap. And now when we introduce that informational experiment, we only see movement on the issues for which there is the gap. The issues for which there is no gap, we see no change. So in other words, we think this is a sort of first stage result. It shows that politicians are learning as a function of the information that we gave them. The next thing we did is looked at politicians' first order beliefs, right? what they personally care about after having been given this information. And we see some evidence that politicians' own concerns are changing as a function of the report that we gave them. So after giving them the report, politicians were 9.8 percentage points more likely to say that pollution is important, very important. They're 9.5 percentage points more likely to say minority rights were important, which again had that big gap at the beginning as well. There's no statistically significant effect on the issue of climate change, but when we construct an index that combines both of these things to look at environmental issues broadly, we see a statistically significant effect on this as well. So in other words, there's evidence of politicians learning about voter preferences and evidence of some updating in terms of their own personal preferences. So what's the effect on sort of more concrete policy outcomes? What we look at next is whether or not the information led to an uptick in politicians' sense of urgency, the need for policy action on different issues. And what we see is looking at these different issues, rising sea levels, flooding, extreme heat, deforestation, air pollution. There's no effect of this information on politicians' perceptions of urgency with these different issues. And then we look next at the effect of the information on support for concrete policies, this blanket deforestation ban, as well as a carbon tax. And again, we see no effect of this information on these concrete policy issues. So again, we think this is puzzling. Politicians are learning in the face of new evidence, and even nominally updating their own personal preferences. But this learning and updated set of beliefs didn't lead to a change in willingness to support specific policy proposals. So we think, what explains these seemingly inconsistent findings? So we turn to two explanations, and I'll go through these sort of quick. I know I only have a few minutes left. So the first explanation we consider is that there might be sort of relatively limited scope for updating support for policy action. Like I showed you, on average, politicians misperceive voter preferences for environmental issues, but of course not all do, right? Maybe 30 or 40% of politicians actually do a good job of estimating voter preferences. And for them, the information should have no effect, which could generate floor effects, right? It's dragging down the overall treatment. And so what we do here is we construct a measure of high or low misperceptions of voter preferences that draws on data from the first wave of the survey. And so politicians that are highly misperceived at baseline are those that say voters on average believe pollution to be somewhat or very unimportant. We know that voters think it's important, but if a politician said voters thought it was unimportant, then we say these are misperceived politicians. And then we rerun the same analysis. Okay? We look at the effect of the information on support for these different policy proposals based on whether or not a politician here on the left-hand side had sort of correct perceptions, otherwise known as low misperceptions, or they had a high misperceptions, right? They were highly wrong about what voters wanted at the beginning. And so on the right-hand panel, what you see is that there's a huge effect of information on support for this deforestation ban, but only among politicians who were wrong at the beginning about what voters wanted. So like intuition here is that if you know exactly what voters want, and then we tell you voters want this thing, there's no updating that's going to happen because they already are correct, right? But if we tell them that they're very wrong, then they're going to update. And this is in fact sort of what we show. The second explanation, I think, is more sort of exciting to us, or not exciting, but consistent with our theoretical framework, which is that the costs to environmental policy action are simply too high in the Indonesian context for this sort of misperception correction to actually have an effect on policy outcomes. So like I said, in many Indonesian contexts, local elites really benefit from the status quo policy in action, which in rural places is characterized by environmental exploitation, mining, palm oil plantations, so on and so forth. Politicians, for instance, may be receiving rents from these local elites through campaign finance donations or just outright bribery. And this we think can be preventing these voter preferences from encouraging action. So what we do in order to see if this is preventing the information from having an effect is we construct a proxy for the level of clientelism in Indonesia. And this proxy is based on, I think, really amazing data that's available through the KPK website, the Anti-Corruption Commission website, that requires all public officials in Indonesia at a structural level to report their total assets each year. Now, you have to imagine that politicians and policymakers are lying on this form, right? They're not reporting their true assets. If they have 5 Lamborghinis, they're not going to say that, right? They're going to say, no, I only have 1 Lamborghini. Very modest, right? And so what we do is we create a standardized index that looks at comparisons across districts, right? So in other words, we're not looking at the absolute number, we're looking at the relative number, and we're assuming that there's this sort of intercept shift that happens from this bias, right? And we assume that if there are high assets, that reflects high levels of clientelism, and vice versa. And then we rerun the analysis. So here on the y-axis is the estimated treatment effect of that informational intervention on support for these 2 different policy issues. And again, I want to draw your attention to this right-hand panel. So on the left-hand side of the right panel, these are places that have very low numbers of assets. In other words, low levels of clientelism here on the left-hand side. And then on the far right-hand side, these are places that have high levels of clientelism, as reflected by very rich public officials. Okay. And you see that the effect of information on support for the deforestation ban gets worse as we move to richer and richer places. Okay. And the sort of statistical test of the interaction term is statistically significant here. And so we interpret this as evidence that the intervention worked on promoting support for a deforestation ban, but only in places where there's very little elite capture. Right? In places where there's a lot of elite capture, in fact, the intervention sort of reduced support for this deforestation. So again, we think this reflects that there's these costs to policy action imposed by local elites. All right, so to wrap up, what I've shown you are a sort of set of, I think, 3 findings, right? First, voters care about environmental issues more than politicians do, and politicians are very bad at estimating voter concern, right? They radically underestimate how much voters care. We did this neat experiment in wave 2, where we provided politicians with this information about voter concern and how bad they are at estimating it. And it does lead them to update their perceptions and even their own personal preferences. But it didn't lead to change in terms of support for concrete policy action. And so we introduced this model that guides our mechanism analysis. And what we show, we think, is that the additional evidence points to the constraining role of clientelism and the costs that elites are able to impose on policymakers for deviations from the status quo. And how these costs constrain information from converting into information about voter preferences from converting into policy in the end, right? Okay, so I'll stop there. I think that's about 45 minutes. I'll take a seat. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick, for the exceptional talk, very thought-provoking, and some great data that you have collected as well. Really looking forward to what comes out of it in terms of publications or other projects to follow up. So the floor is open for questions. If you have any from Kevin or Joyce or Mark. Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, Nick, again.
Hey, Mark.
Thanks very much for that. This is a fascinating talk. Kevin, who's there in the audience, I think will also agree that we think what you're talking about is very relevant elsewhere in the region, particularly the Philippines. So I think what you're onto there is, and of course we could go beyond that and say perhaps a trend in the developing world, although I think it's important not to over idealize, not that you'd said so or did so, but one could perhaps say implicitly, well, and in wealthier countries, people are doing more. We've seen the problems of collective action on environmentalism, and if Trump gets in again, we will see a lot of environmental regulations reversed in the U.S., which is already a laggard place. Anyway, just to point that out, that we don't want to suggest that Indonesia looks that bad compared to the competition, because the competition is not doing that well either. Just wanted to add that point. My question is, so politicians don't get it, basically, is what you're saying. And and you're using kind of this economics-based formal modeling. So to speak in those terms, there must be imperfect competition, because in a very competitive marketplace, if you don't get it, you're out. You're lost at the next election, because your competition is not sleeping. They will get in there and get to those preferences, because that can get them votes, right? So that's what I'm interested in, and also related to that, the role of civil society, because isn't civil society kind of the social movement aspect that, on the one hand, should be providing this kind of information to society generally and politicians in particular, and also getting citizens mobilized, so that if the politicians aren't responding to their needs, that they can be mobilized in a way that they can, as I said, provide adequate competition, so politicians better listen to these issues, better react to these issues, better respond, and maybe even do something about it, rather than just talking about it if they do know about it. It was one kind of notable absence in your talk. As an actor, civil society really didn't make an appearance at all. So I'm wondering about that aspect as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Those are, great comments, great questions. The first thing about the sort of developed country distinction, you're totally right. And I don't think I circulated the paper, but the current draft of the paper sort of opens with a discussion about how the costs of climate change are going to be disproportionately felt by developing countries. And this is true, but it does set up the paper and the project as something that's unique to developing countries, which is not, I think, our intention at all, right? I think it's the case across the world that climate change mitigation and adaptation is being hampered by elite interests that benefit from a status quo of environmental exploitation, right? And this is true in the United States and in developed democracies as well, right? What Indonesians, I think, call clientelism, we simply call campaign finance, right? So I think there's a different way of through which these legal or extra legal costs that elites try and impose actually bite when it comes to policymakers, right? So we are thinking, I think, flexibly about this framework, and we think it helps explain environmental policy and action in Indonesia, across the developing world, but also across the developed world as well. Now, your two questions, they're also very good. The first question, as I understand it, is like this question about perfect competition. Why don't voters just throw the bums out and replace a politician or a policymaker with a politician who actually supports environmental protections? We agree, but the fact is that they're not doing that, right? So we think that this motivates our project. We're trying to understand why it's the case that voters are not, in fact, throwing the bums out, even though they're not producing environmental policy that they demand. And we think, a couple things are going on, and the next stage of the project is going to try and get at this a little bit more. But one of the things that we think is going on is that the costs to voters communicating their preferences are actually considerably higher than, say, theoretical models would predict, right? It's very costly for voters to throw the bums out, right? To hold politicians accountable. It takes time, it takes information, it takes organization, right? Which I think points to the second question that you raised, and perhaps this is why you raised it, around the role of civil society, which again, you're totally right. We don't, I think, theorize or really bring into the narrative or the argument at all. But civil society, of course, plays a huge role in helping voters overcome collective action problems. And to overcome, which constitutes, again, a sort of big cost to communication, is this collective action problem. In civil society organizations, I think this is what you're getting at, can help voters overcome this cost. And, I hadn't thought about this point until just now, but we're in the process of trying to design a new survey module to get at how voters themselves are thinking about the costs to communicating their preferences for environmental policy to politicians. And, I think we can include some questions about civil society organizations in the next survey to try and get a little bit more of a sense of how voters view those organizations as alleviating the costs of their communications, their preferences. So thank you for that question, which I think will sort of push us in a good direction in the next stage of this project. Yeah, thanks, Mark. I hope that answers your question.
Just a quick follow-up on
Yeah.
what Mark was just mentioning about like why aren't these politicians voted out of office? Could it be that there is also like a matter of like how these different policy priorities are ranked in terms of like maybe those issues that politicians believe that are especially salient in the mind of voters today are considered by voters as being at least as important, if not possibly even more important than environmental protection. So consider the case of, say, a politician who performs like very poorly in terms of like protecting the environment or, trying to curb pollution or this kind of clientelistic practices, but at the same time, they deliver broad-based social services, such as like healthcare or education. So it's not entirely clear to me, or at least I don't think it's that automatic that, this kind of like politicians we would expect them to be voted out.
Yeah. So maybe this is what you're saying, it's like.
Right, because you're asking like, well, what these are, do you think like any of these issues are very important, right?
Yeah, and they're going to say they're all important, but the question is,
yeah,
which one's more important than the other, right? So
would that be worth looking into that?
Yeah. So, I think there's, in fact, you're sort of a good person to ask about this, because one of the things we're struggling with is how we want to design this question to get at this for voters, right? One way to do it is just to give voters these 6 issues and say, rank them in terms of your policy priorities. I think a better way to get at it is that Indonesian politics has this sort of mental map of environmental policy as existing in a zero-sum game with an economic development. Indonesian voters talk about this, politicians talk about it, right? So it's not as much about like the ranking of environmental policy over health or education, as much as asking voters, how much development are you willing to give up in order to protect the environment? And so we're trying to, I think this would get at the issue that you're raising a little bit better than just a ranking, right? Because what might be going on is that voters, whatever, like 55% of voters say the economy is important. The same numbers say pollution is important. They genuinely believe these 2 issues are very important. But if you ask them, which one would you rather have? 100% will say economic development, and 0% will say pollution. And I think maybe this is what politicians are responding to. Maybe that's why we get policy interaction, right? So, but I don't know how to design this survey question. What I mean?
Yeah, I completely agree that if you ask the kind of questions, which is more important, economic development or environmental protection, there's really a lot that you are
missing. It's like you wouldn't see like this kind of like pattern that is still like
Yeah.
quite important. I've been doing like the last couple of years some work on popular understanding of democracy, and that's exactly the same issue. Like if you're looking at the research on East and Southeast Asia, what do people believe democracy is about? A lot of it is based on asking them which is most important. Is it like civil rights, or is it like having like access to healthcare and education for all, and this kind of things? When you see that kind of questions, then many will take the more like a substantive or policy-oriented sort of understanding of democracy. But this does not mean that they care little about rights. That's a misinterpretation in a way.
It's like there's got to be a way. I mean, this is sort of like a political economy paper, so I'll just continue with the vocabulary. It's like there's got to be a way to capture the elasticity of demand for these sorts of things, right? In other words, how are people in sort of a continuum thinking about these trade-offs between these things, right? It's not like people don't care about these rights. They don't care about democracy. It's that they have this mental model that says, I'm willing to give up a little of this for a lot of something else, right? So their demand for those things is highly elastic with respect to that issue. And I think that's something we need to, maybe politicians are bad at estimating this number, but they're really good at estimating that number,
Speaking of which, you mentioned you had a couple of pet theories about like what explains the difference across
this one,
ability to estimate across policy areas.
Yeah. So my pet theory, and then maybe you have a pet theory or someone else has a pet theory. So basically, like, these three issues, health, education, the economy, they're really, really good at estimating how much voters want them. Okay. Now, these two issues in particular, in a patronage democracy, are very, very important for politicians. The way that politicians win support is by getting voters access to health and education, right? They promise them that you're going to get a sort of doctor's appointment, or your daughter or son is going to be able to go to a good school or whatever. And so they spend a lot of time with constituency service managing these issues. This is how they maintain power. And so because they maintain power this way, maybe they develop a very keen intuition for how much voters want these things because they talk about it so much. But in a patronage democracy, pollution and climate change are pure public goods, which means that they're non-excludable. So you can't prevent certain voters from getting them and other voters from not getting them. In other words, if you prevent pollution, everyone gets clean air. And then you can't stop certain voters from getting it, which means that you can't cultivate support by restricting access to it. And so my pet theory is that in a patronage democracy, politicians have incentives to develop very good intuitions for club goods, but very bad incentives to develop good intuitions for pure public goods to which they can't exclude access. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I was also thinking that it's it's easier to target voters like more specifically, more narrowly with things such as healthcare and education, and not so much with the others.
Yeah, with like, if you solve climate change, it's like,
I wonder if there's also like a matter of like maybe beliefs about how easy it is to claim credit.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point.
That could be part of the issue.
Yeah. So I had this paper with Allison Post about city size and public service provision in Indonesia. And one of the things we find is that small municipalities in Brazil, as well as in Indonesia, do a much better job at building schools and building clinics. And we thought this was interesting. And when we went and interviewed people in these policymakers in these towns and compared it to the interviews in big cities, what they said was, we like building schools because it's very easy to claim credit in a small town. Like everyone knows that we did it. It's easy to coordinate with other politicians. But again, with pollution, it's like whichever way the wind blows, even if you do a lot to try and stop it, if the neighboring
kabupaten or whatever is still burning crops, you'll still sort of get misattributed for not doing much on the issue. So yeah, I think credit claiming is very good explanation. We have a part of the paper where we speculate on these different explanations.
Okay.
But again, it's hard to get good evidence on the divergence.
I also wanted to ask you, I think about the experimental design, like how do you design the treatment in terms of like delivering information about what voters believe about these issues. So I'm thinking that one of the first chart you showed us, it shows like quite a bit of variation across province in terms of like how salient I think pollution or environmental protection is. So when you are delivering the treatment, telling these politicians what voters want and how right or wrong politicians are about their beliefs, about voters' beliefs, are you? Is this about like voters in general, or is it like their own voters in their own?
Yeah. So we just did it at the national level. We weren't able.
Okay.
We didn't have enough at the time. We didn't have enough statistical power to break it down by their own constituency. So what we showed them in the report was, first we showed them this graph, like literally this graph. But in order to facilitate the interpretation of the graph on the part of politicians who presumably don't have a PhD in political science, what we did was we just created a bar, and then we showed like negative 25 percentage points, or negative 10 percentage points, and then we showed them this graph as well. Then we showed them a few other graphs, and we trained the enumerators. But again, this is at the national level, right? So these are just national level aggregates. But we train the enumerators to be able to deliver just like a 10-minute presentation.
Okay.
And the reaction that I heard from the enumerators was that the politicians quite liked getting this report. These are local politicians, and basically they got 10 minutes of free political consulting. We told them, here's what voters want. And so they were, I think, quite engaged and excited to receive the report. But I mean, to your first point, I think you were talking about the regional variation.
Yeah, because I was thinking maybe they hear that voters in general.
Yeah, but again, like if you look down here, this is the lowest in Kulu, 45%, and then the highest is 70%. But again, most of that is dispersed around 65%, so it really just runs from 45 to 65, which
It is a very cool chart.
there's I mean, what I think is interesting here. So this is the percentage of Indonesian voters who say pollution is very important. Now, the percentage of voters, the provinces in which the lowest percentage of voters say it's very important, Kalimantan Selatan, Tengah, Utara, Bengkulu, these are places with palm oil plantations. Like this is where burning really takes place. Right? And yet these are the places in which the fewest number of respondents are saying that pollution is very important. So I think part of what's going on is this economic development issue. Voters in these places suffer under central government enforcement of this blanket ban on the use of burning, because it means that it's more expensive for them to now clear their fields. They have to use tractors. They can't be burning because there's more attention on these places. And so I think there's this sort of negative polarization going on as a function of this mental map of every gain of environmental protection is a loss for economic development. You see what I mean? And so voters that are exposed to this environmental protection in these places say, no, pollution is actually not important. Let us go back to burning because we were able to make so much more money when we did it that way. Again, this is sort of just a pet theory.
I was just thinking, well, you have like some, research, resource extraction heavy provinces over there at the bottom, but then you have like half that is quite close to the top.
Yeah, that's right.
And presumably there too, there is a lot of, similar issues and
No, so
So it's very interesting. Yeah. Now, speaking about like what issues are salient, can you go back to that slide you had about candidates talking about like different things? Like yeah, this one. So you have like quite a substantial increase between like in 2019 and 2024 in a lot of these categories. Is it like what's happening? Is it like just better data, or is it like or is it that like I don't know, maybe elections are getting more programmatic in a way?
yeah, I don't know. So so I guess development issues have stayed sort of roughly similar. So here
Mhm.
and here, but yeah, health increased here, here, over here too. So I think there's two things going on. One is that identity politics became much less salient in 2024 than it was in 2019. You know, identity politics in 2019 was very top. You know, so many of these campaign platforms mentioned things relating to Islam, and so that's sort of gone, and so that's freeing up space for perhaps these other issues. But the other thing is that, you know, parties, so only 60% of candidates provided campaign platforms in 2019, and now it's closer to 100%. Now I excluded the 40% that didn't from 2019, but again, they're just, the process of submitting these official platforms wasn't super institutionalized. And now parties are like, oh, this is a great way for us to introduce candidates to voters. I think they're forcing politicians to put more effort into them. So perhaps they're mentioning sort of more issues that they care about. So, you know, this is, I mean, what we're doing here is we're just looking at, again, the share of platforms that mention one of these issues. It's not a sophisticated analysis.
That's still interesting.
It is.
Have you had a chance to look at whether they vary across space, across
No,
province, like the share of, say, candidates mentioning the environment, for example?
No, we haven't. You can look at that.
Because it would be interesting to see if you know, there's an overlap with the kind of like a variation that your survey data is capturing.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we could do is look at like, yeah, we could look at whether or not it correlates with survey data at a Kabupaten level. We could also look, you know, does it correlate with air quality indices, for instance? You know, but yeah, this data is actually on my website for both 2019 and 2024. So if you're interested in using it, it's freely available.
Nice.
I can't see. Is there anybody else raising their hand, Diego, or can I ask a couple more?
Kevin has a question.
Thank you for an interesting lecture. The topic is relevant, especially for me. It's from the Philippines, so we also face interlocking, environmental concerns, and also the Philippines is among the deadliest countries for environmentalists, so raising environmental concerns, especially involving corporations and local warlords may get you into trouble. So in view of such, my question is, as a scholar who has studied preferences for policy actions, did you come across public opinion on quote-unquote progressive environmental policies? And if so, how and under what conditions do policymakers support such progressive policies?
And so what would a progressive environmental policy
For
be?
example, carbon tax or the reduction or implementation for renewable support for renewable energy at the expense of corporations.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, one of the sort of main outcomes that we look at in the, you know, final analysis here is the sort of support for carbon tax, right? So one of the question that asked politicians, you know, I can't remember the exact text, but basically, would you support a carbon tax? You know, the challenge with this question, and I think one of the reasons why we see no effects on this is because politicians in Indonesia are not well socialized to the idea of a carbon tax. Like they don't know what it's referring to. So at the national level, I think politicians know, but we were doing this at a local level. And one of the things that we found is like, when we ask politicians, for instance, do you support a blanket ban on deforestation on secondary forests? Basically 100% of respondents said either yes or no. But when it came to the carbon tax, about 40% of respondents just said, I have no idea. Which we think means that a lot of politicians just don't know what it means. And then I think probably the other 60%, most of them didn't know what it means, but they wanted to seem like I knew what it means. And so they gave a bogus answer, right? But my reaction to this question is like the issue of a carbon tax needs to be, I mean, at least on the part of climate activists, if they want to see this policy proposal achieved, it needs to be better communicated to politicians. Is like one of the takeaways that I had from this particular policy proposal. We only asked about these two policy proposals: a ban on deforestation on secondary forest, right? So regrowth forest, and support for a carbon tax. We had initially hoped to ask for support for other issues as well. So for instance, we initially had a question about, would you support the construction of a seawall, like to protect against rising sea levels and environmental damages from flooding? But one of the challenges we ran into is that this survey was too long, so we had to cut this stuff, right? So it's a logistical problem. So these are the only two. And I would characterize a carbon tax, like you say, as a progressive policy issue. Deforestation, I think, as well, but it's more of like a standard environmental protection rather than something that's more new and progressive. Yeah.
Mark, we have plenty of raised hands here, but if you want to ask a question, you can.
Well, if we still have a bit of time, so why not? I'll
Yeah.
and I must preface this with saying I have two comments and two questions, so I'll get at it. The comments are, if you're looking for a politician with the PhD, you can of course go to Anis.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
He got his PhD from Northern Illinois University, so there are some politicians capable of understanding that. I'm guessing.
Yes.
The other comment is it's notable, given your point about the increase in interest and willingness to put up political programs by Indonesian politicians, contrast sharply with the Trumpist Republican Party, which has now stopped publishing a program and just basically said, as of 2020, we'll do what Trump wants.
Yeah.
And that perhaps goes along with your point about the U.S. is now about identity politics. So programs don't matter as much, given the prominence of identity politics. An interesting thing to think about, I think. The questions are, so I'm wondering about the limits of your methods, because we're coming up against a lot of questions that arise, and you're kind of looking for ways that you can kind of get these through, tweaking your data instrument. But I'm wondering if there's some things that can only be got at through qualitative methods. And, looking at politicians in more detail. I mean, I'm thinking of, when you mentioned patronage democracy, look at all the work that's been done on patronage democracy, particularly this comparative study that recently came out by some prominent Southeast Asian scholars, and look at their work and the kind of methods they employ. Isn't that a very promising way? My question about civil society, isn't that a way to get at this issue of civil society? What Kevin just raised about the Philippines is there's some sort of deterrence or even fear factor that's out there that keeps people from, raising issues that might endanger certain interests, which would want to defend themselves, this kind of thing that surveys would miss, right? So I'm wondering if one needs mixed methods, as it were, to get at some of these issues. And the second question is, because you raised it as kind of an aside, I've been curious about this for a long time. So why no polarization along education? Yeah. And that is obviously one of the most striking things about the US and increasingly about Europe as well. Or maybe they've run in parallel. I don't know the literature that well, but I know in the US it's become such a striking cleavage. Why is it that, or what kind of theories are people developing that you're familiar with about Indonesia? And I think it's true of a lot of other Southeast Asian cases where education doesn't provide this difference, particularly on such an issue like environment, which, as your own analysis shows, based a lot on information that even elite politicians, albeit local ones, without PhDs, but still should know about, right? Or you think they know about, but still don't. And the better educated they were, you think the more they know about. But and voters who know about this more, who are better educated, would know about more. So you think this would be a factor in these kind of issues.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Mark. Your first question about qualitative methods, I mean, the very short answer is yes. I mean, I think answering these questions about, say, how politicians are thinking about the cost to policy action, or voters are thinking about the cost to communicating their preferences for environmental policy. I mean, survey methods can, I think, attempt to quantify these things, but they don't get at the sort of meat of how and why voters or politicians are thinking the way they are about these particular issues. And you point to, I assume you're talking about Ed and Meredith and Paul and Alan's recent book. We're heavily influenced in our thinking about clientelism in Indonesia, and especially the costs that sort of elite interests are able to impose on politicians. We're heavily influenced by Ed and Ward's recent book, Democracy for Sale. I don't know if you've seen this volume, Mark, in which they draw, I think, they're both really excellent mixed method researchers. They do good ethnographic research. So I think we draw quite heavily on their work. I spend a good deal of time in Indonesia. I spend time talking to politicians. I'm not skilled at integrating that information into a written manuscript, and I've never have been. But I do the work, and I think let that sort of reflect how I'm thinking about, I hope it infuses the manuscript. But we haven't discussed doing formal qualitative interviews, but maybe we should. Certainly for getting at these civil society organizations, it's hard to conduct a formal survey of civil society groups. I mean, you need sort of more traditional, I think, qualitative methods to get at that stuff. So I appreciate the suggestion, and I'll take it to my co-author. He's an economist, so I don't know how he'll react to this particular suggestion. He might fall out of his chair or something. I don't know. Your second question, why is there no educational polarization in Indonesia? I mean, it's a great question. So I think I had two hypotheses, and I'd be curious to hear Diego's thoughts on this as well. My first hypothesis is that one thing that's going on in Indonesia that's different than other countries is that education correlates with conservatism, and particularly religious conservatism, or what we might call religious Islamic modernism in Indonesia. I mean, would you say this is fair, Diego? Islamic modernism is
to an extent, yes, but I would say it depends a bit on also how you measure things, depending on, for example, I remember asking one of the surveys like a few years ago, those I did for ISIS, whether they identified as a santry as opposed to abangan, this sort of thing. If you look at this kind of measures, you will find that the santries are indeed significantly have a lower level of education and income.
The santries,
yes,
lower education
as compared with those who self-identify abangan. But admittedly, there was only the specific. I think it was only two regions, two provinces.
Yeah.
East and Central Java. And yeah, if you're looking at more broadly at not only like Islamism, but also like a range of factors, like a range of like policy preferences,
Yeah.
I think it's more complex than that.
Yeah.
One thing, yeah, like high level of education, I think they do correlate with a certain type of conservative ideologies in some instances, and maybe not so much in others, depending on what you mean by conservative also.
Yeah.
Um,
I think,
yeah.
I mean, I think what I was trying to get at with this, Mark, and I think sort of Diego's comment speaks to this a little bit too, is that there's a lot of, I think, Indonesian politics can't be situated on a left-right axis for one, and there's a lot of sort of countervailing forces at work. So I think this sort of religious conservatism and the extent to which it correlates with education is one thing. But the second thing that I want to point out is that Indonesia is unique in terms of how its youth break down, like sort of generational politics. Right? So what you're seeing here, and you can look at any of these three different panels are just different surveys. But say you look at the sort of far right panel, which is the indicator exit poll, right? The gray bar is support for Prabowo, right? The sort of nationalist, authoritarian figure. The black bar is support for Anies Baswedan, the Islamist. And then the light gray bar is for Ganjar, who, I wouldn't say he's the progressive candidate, but he's sort of like the secular nationalist. And what you see is that support for Prabowo is actually much higher among the youngest voters, who are also the voters, by the way, who are most likely to be getting a college degree, right? Much more than their parents who weren't availing themselves of college education when they were younger because there weren't as many economic opportunities to do so. And so I think what I'm getting at is that younger voters in Indonesia are surprisingly conservative. They're also more likely to be college educated. And this is, I think, being, on the other hand, sort of countervailed or counterweighted by the more generic tendency for older voters to hold more conservative attitudes. And so you've got this sort of weird set of sort of crisscrossing political behavioral attitudes in Indonesia that I think just dilute the educational polarization phenomenon that we're seeing in other countries around the world. So, I mean, again, that's not a super satisfying answer. I think it's a great question. I hope someone does a more systematic study of it.
But do you see this like a difference across generations also when it comes to preferences for environmental protection?
No. There's sort of very little variation. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I'll rerun this graph though for.
Yeah, because it's struggle a bit how to make sense of the Prabowo vote in these elections. It's a Prabowo that is quite different from Prabowo.
Yeah, that's right.
I think I wrote something like for Global Asia, just published this month, I think, where I basically described this as Prabowo version 4.0.
So we actually just wrote, me and Nathaniel and Risa wrote a piece for Pacific Affairs and about Prabowo's election, and the title is Third Time's a Charm. That's like,
Third time's a charm. Okay.
Similar to your Prabowo 4.0.
I will say, there's the authoritarian like Prabowo that we saw just when the new order collapsed, and then the Prabowo was running with Megawati, and then there's the populist, sort of like Islamist friendly Prabowo, and then there's this who's running with this young
boy
who doesn't seem to have much substance. It's just like catchphrases and zings and not much else. So is it still a conservative vote? I don't know.
No, I mean, I don't think, yeah,
If,
it's hard to capture, I suppose, what it signals in a more comparative sense.
yeah,
I think it does signal it's symbolic of sort of authoritarian personality.
mm,
It's symbolic of a nationalist vote. Right? I mean, I do think it signals those things. Now, of course, it doesn't signal any longer, at least in this context, religious conservatism, which Annis captured.
Yeah.
But it's capturing some measure of some axis of what we would call conservatism, I think. I think we are.
okay, I
That's
think
done.
we are out of time. If there are no other questions, I would thank our speaker, thank
you.
for the lovely presentation. Very much
Thank you.
enjoyed
Thank you very
the
much.
discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
Thanks a lot.
Feel better.
Yeah, let's.
Sure, let's take a photo.
Oh yeah.
Title picture.
title
Okay. Slide.
Okay, hold on.
I'll just be below Mark. So the hierarchy is respected.
1, 2, 3, smile. 1, 2, 3.
All right, thank you.
Exciting, very good projects.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks for the comments. Yeah, in some ways, very small group. It's a better discussion.
Well, back to methodological issues. It's quality, not quantity.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that.
It's both. It's
Yeah.
both.
Just to add to what Diego was saying about Probo. By the way, Diego, I couldn't find that online. Is that online yet? Your Global Asia piece?
Yes, it's online. I have a paper copy too, if you want. They send it to me.
Okay, thank you. Is that that what we observers once thought was the progressivism represented by Jacobi turned out to be conservatism, and that was what
Yeah.
transferred to Probo. So it's this kind of and this fits with your talk, I think, Nick, this sort of developmentalist emphasis that, and that plus a few TikTok dances helped kick up support.
Yeah. Have either of you talked to Marcus recently and heard about his new book?
Yeah, I did talk to him. It was fascinating to hear the
Amazing.
insight he had. Yeah.
He's so
It's